What's up, Preacher Creatures? We're so excited that you're here for another episode of the Preacher Creature podcast.
Welcome back. I'm Ashley Lewis, your co-host, and I live in Durham, North Carolina, graduate of Columbia Seminary. I'm currently in a post-seminary immersive learning program called Seminary of the Wild with the Wild Church Network, and I work in both nonprofit and church-based spaces in ministry that has to do with preaching and teaching beyond the human experience for the good of all creation.
And I'm Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary, and I also offer preaching coaching through my website, thepreachingdoctor.com. So if you're interested in taking your preaching up to the next level, hit me up. I'd love to work with you.
The Preacher Creature podcast aims to provide insights and community for weary preachers. We cover books by homileticians and practitioners whose work can help energize and empower compelling preaching.
Yeah, and we're so excited that this is a ministry of Columbia Theological Seminary, and it's one aspect of a larger program. So we have minister renewal programs. So if you want to hike the Camino de Santiago with us, then be on the lookout for that. We also offer mindfulness and yoga retreats for weary preachers. And my colleague at Columbia Seminary, Dr. Anna Carter-Florence, and I will be traveling the country offering scripture engagement workshops. So if you've read her book, Rehearsing Scripture, we can actually bring that into your community. So definitely be on the lookout for what we're going to be doing on that front. And we might be coming to your town soon. So definitely check it out.
So many good offerings and exciting things. You will definitely want to follow the Columbia Preachers Studio for Renewal on social media. And you can find us at Preacher Studio for Renewal.
And if you want to hear more of these videos, then please make sure you subscribe to our channel, and you can hit that little bell icon. That'll give you a notification whenever we load a new episode. And also, if you have topics that you would like us to address, then please send us an email, put a comment down in the description below so that we can kind of make sure that we're tailoring our conversations to things that you really need to learn and understand better as a preacher.
So our guest today, we're so excited to welcome her, is the Reverend Dr. Ruthanna Hooke. She's professor of homiletics at Virginia Theological Seminary. This book, Sacramental Presence, is her newest work, and that is the book that we're going to dive in today. Her other publications include a book called Transforming Preaching. She has numerous essays out, including Queering Worship, Wisdom's Cry and the Task of Preaching, and The Challenge and Promise of Preaching in a Consumer Culture. So those are some of the other works that you can find by her. She is a Linklater voice teacher, which is such an important and fascinating aspect of her homiletical theory. And so she actually, she is also an ordained Episcopal priest, and she brings together these aspects of vocal training, preaching, sacramental theology, and homiletics all together into this incredible book. So we are going to talk a little bit about this Linklater voice method with Dr. Hooke. And to set that up a little bit, if you're not familiar with this method, it's a process that takes participants through a series of step-by-step practical exercises like relaxation, awareness of breath, the experience of the voice vibrating in the body, awareness to all of these aspects, also like how to open up the throat, the development of resonance and range, and the articulation activity that happens in the lips and tongue. So it's a really it's like such an important set of skills that anyone who engages in speaking can learn. And she is trained in this method. So we're excited to hear her talk about what that has to do with the theology of preaching today.
Yeah, and this book really draws all of the aspects of Dr. Hooke's scholarship and her teaching and her wisdom together, which has been so exciting for me to engage. I first encountered Dr. Hooke's work when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, and I saw hers. She'd written it at Yale Divinity School, and I was like, oh, I have to read that book because she was talking about some of the theologians and philosophers that I was addressing in my book. And I had to order it, through Interlibrary Loan, and it came in microfilm because it was so big, they couldn't just send it. So I'm trying to remember from like middle school how I used the microfilm machine at the library. But that book is brilliant. But in a nutshell, what she does is she takes Karl Barth's Theology of Proclamation, and she puts it in a critical conversation with the works of Emmanuel Levinas, Luce Irigaray, Soren Kierkegaard, and Jacques Derrida. So if you know my work, you know that this is just like
right up your alley.
I was so excited to do it. And Sacramental Presence kind of emerges out of her dissertation, but she's kind of moved some of that philosophy to the side so that she can really focus on this deeply theological aspect of proclamation that's centered around the liturgy. And so this sacramental theology of preaching allows her to think about the different aspects of sermon development and delivery. So she looks at the first aspect being the silence. Mm-hmm. So we take this moment of silence to kind of ground ourselves in our body, but also to kind of allow our listeners and the Holy Spirit to kind of be present among us, or make the Spirit's presence felt among us. And that leads us into the blessing, which is similar to like the blessing of the bread and the Eucharistic meal. And here is where we're evoking the Holy Spirit to suffuse our speech and our gestures and our everything that goes into the actual delivery of a sermon. And then that leads to the breaking open of the bread, or in this case, breaking open of the word, that entails also a breaking open of the preacher's mm-hmm. body. So she thinks about us as like sees us as kind of sacramental offerings before God, that doesn't denegate or ignore the fact that we are human, fleshly creatures, right. But it allows us to kind of open ourselves up to what God might be saying through us. And then the final move of the book is this idea of giving, which is kind of looking towards the Feast of Resurrection in the Eucharistic liturgy. So it's a really brilliant way to think about preaching at a deeply theological level, but not so abstract, which is what we tend to think of when we think of theology, but it's really grounded in the body. And this is a brilliant book. You guys have to read it if you haven't read it already. Homileticians, I know some of y'all are watching this podcast. You need to read this book and assign it to your students, because it will open up so many possibilities for proclamation. And I know I'm going to be using it in my classes moving forward, and I know you'll want to check this out. Let me just give you a teaser of one quote from the book. I don't want to steal any of Dr. Hooke's thunder when she joins us, but she says, "When preachers allow the Spirit to breathe in their preaching, the Spirit can disrupt preaching in deeply personal ways, awakening the preacher to aspects of personhood that are often kept under rigid control and considered off limits for preaching." So this book is great in that your students, or those of you who are deeply like theological in your understanding of proclamation, there's a lot for you to feast on here. But also, rather than thinking about like, here's our theology of preaching and let's make space for, differently able-bodied people, people of color, queer, trans preachers, because she focuses in on the body, not as an afterthought, but as the kind of core movement of the book, it opens spaces for us to lean into our finitude, our humanness, in a really beautiful way that's not divorced from our theology, but they're integrated. Right. So well done.
Yeah, it's so nice to see. It is so thoughtful, so thorough in the embodied theology. Like you are getting a grounding of embodied preaching that I really haven't encountered elsewhere. And it's exciting to see such a thorough take on it that invites, truly invites people from wherever, whatever your embodiment looks like, there's a place for it. And I also love how then that is really seen through the lens of the Eucharist. So our friends out there who are going to really just want to nerd out on all of the Eucharistic theology are going to be thinking about preaching in a new way, because we think we're seeing it through the eyes of what happens at the Holy Table, at the communion meal. So, so I thought that was such a brilliant way of saying, like, this body of Jesus, this bread that we break, what about our bodies as preachers, which are also being offered in the worship moment? So it's
Yeah.
exciting stuff.
Yeah, and I think this is going to really bridge some kind of divergent perspectives. Some of my students who are from the Episcopalian tradition or Lutheran tradition, who have a really high view of the liturgy, can sometimes treat preaching as kind of it's the afterthought. It's like the sprinkles on the cupcake, but the cupcake was fine without it. But let's go ahead and add it because it makes it a little bit better. And then on the other side, you have the evangelical and even some mainline students for whom preaching is the central
Right.
component of worship, and the liturgy and the Eucharistic meal are just we'll add that in at the end, or we'll do it every once in a while, once a quarter maybe. But her book is going to really kind of build this bridge between these two divergent perspectives that I think is going to offer some really great dialogue across denominations.
Yeah, definitely. And this, what I also found was so interesting about the book was the way that a lot of it focuses on the things that happen before the preaching moment even begins. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit with Dr. Hooke, but there are entire chapters and entire sections of the book that deal with the silence, the breath before, what's happening in the breath itself. And that is something that you don't necessarily pick up a book on preaching and think that you're going to read half of it before the words are even spoken. But there's something there's something so enticing and intriguing and thoughtful about that, where the breath, for example, like plays such an important role.
Yeah. And I think that a year ago, if I'd read this a year ago, I think I would have had a very different experience of it. But it's been through my process of becoming a certified yoga instructor and all of the teaching and learning that kind of went along with that, that I'm seeing things in this book that I know I never would have seen before. So one thing that was really telling is one of the early classes, they paired us up, and you were kind of for 5 minutes just watching your partner breathe and just make notes about it, and then we switched and the other person did it. So the guy that I was with, his name is Ruan, and he's from South Africa, and he said, "Oh, you're only breathing with your chest." And I was like, "Well, yeah, that's where my lungs are." But what I learned is that like our natural, like a baby's breath, if you ever watch a baby, it's all belly breaths. But, as we get older, we're taught like, okay, well, we have to like suck our tummies in. So, we don't look, fat or anything. And, for men, you have to like lift your chest out so that you look more masculine or something. But it's the idea, and she talks about this in the book, that like the first breath goes into the belly. So when we breathe in, our belly should expand first, and then it rises up to our lungs. And then when we breathe out, our belly contracts. And something that's fascinating about this, like from a theological perspective, it's brilliant, but just from a neurobiological perspective, I learned that, and especially for students who are really nervous when they start to preach, what happens is when we're nervous, our brains go into fight or flight kind of mode. And so that causes us to breathe more into our chest, more shallow breathing, which activates our sympathetic nervous system because our brains can't tell whether we're needing to run from a saber-toothed tiger or we're just nervous about preaching our first sermon. So by doing the slow belly breath at the beginning of the sermon, not only does it have powerful theological implications and the way that we're allowing the Spirit to be present with us before we start to kind of impose our thoughts in that space, but when we do a nice belly breath, it triggers our parasympathetic nervous system, which slows down our heart rate, causes our breathing to become more steady. And so then we actually have the capacity to proclaim, not just from our chest, but from our diaphragm. And so for those of you who are already kind of more embodied beings, I think you're going to find a lot in this book to celebrate and ways to connect with your mindfulness, your yoga practice. All these things kind of are linked and through the breath, which is great.
And then you're getting this deep theology that supports it. Like for me, my similar moment of awareness came around the vocal aspects. So I mentioned Dr. Hooke is a Linklater vocal instructor, and I was starting to make some connections being a singer to that breath as a singer, how you can support your voice in singing is
Mhm.
related to what we should also be doing in preaching, where if you're breathing in your lungs, you'll pass out. You really have to make sure that the belly breath is happening, because that is what supports the kind of expression that we want to make sure we're having in singing, but also in preaching. And so then we're not only getting a bit of how this needs to happen in the body to free our voice, but it's theologically rooted and supported. There's an entire, case behind it for why God is active and what we know about God in the breath and in the freeing of the voice. Um,
Yeah.
I'll share that over the last few years, I had some thyroid issues. I've had thyroid disease for several years, but I had a little spot of thyroid cancer that had to be removed, and I am so thankful that it was pretty much surgery and done, and I didn't have a lot of ongoing treatment or really acute kind of life threatening um, uh, situations that came out of this bit of cancer, and I feel really grateful for that. But it does open up just this realization of finitude of life, of the fragility
Mhm.
of these things that we depend on every single day. Not knowing after surgery when you wake up if all of your vocal cord nerves will still be intact, and if the things that
Yeah.
you love to do, like singing and preaching, will still be there for you after. And then you get through recovery. I'm really thankful. Again, all this stuff went well for me. And then I had the kind of the next phase of recovery is just kind of retraining parts of the vocal cord nerves that did maybe get a little bit nicked or a little damaged. They have to be re awakened, and you have to make those
Mm.
connections again so that you can come back into the full voice from before. That's really how I experienced it. And I'm still now, for the rest of my life, I will be focused on how my voice feels and sounds in a way that I never thought about before I had thyroid disease and, surgery on my throat. But
Yeah.
it's the book has made me think about freeing my voice in a way that I feel like I needed for this season of life as I look ahead to, like, how am I going to care for my voice? So yeah, we really can't take those things for granted as preachers either. And this gives us a new way of understanding, again, the theology behind what's really happening in our breathing and our speaking.
Yeah. I love that, Ashley. And you talk about freeing the voice. It's been a process of discovery for me that not everybody in this world has the same privileges that I have as
Mm,
a white, mostly straight, cisgender, currently able-bodied man. I mean, the American pulpit right now is kind of designed for people with all of my identity
right.
markers. And some of our colleagues like Hiram Kim Cragg at the University of Toronto and Lise Faye, who teaches at McCormick Theological Seminary, have really challenged the field of homiletics to say that it shouldn't just be the queer preachers and the preachers of color and the differently abled preachers who have to name their particularity,
Right.
but the white straight guys need to do that too, right? Because our embodiment shapes everything about how we approach text, how we understand the world, how we interpret this connection between the text and the contexts that we find
Yeah.
ourselves in. And in Dr. Hooke, because she's so grounds it in an embodied theology, opens up a different way of beginning to think about those
Mm,
things. And for white preachers to speak out against white supremacy and racism, and she has a section on how this kind of preaching would lead to climate justice or eco preaching.
yeah.
It's really brilliant. And Ashley, I know you've done a lot of work on this front.
Yeah.
So I bet this was a good part of the book for you.
It was. And I think I'm excited that we'll get a chance to talk about this more directly with Dr. Hook. But so not to take too much away from that conversation, but I see the potential in her theology, this sacramental presence way of preaching, for making the connections that can happen within every single sermon, that where
Yeah.
so often we think of bringing social issues into our preaching as topical or specialized, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we might treat that as like, well, if I'm going to say these things, then the sermon, we falsely kind of think that the sermon's going to be all about those ideas. And
Right.
we miss the connections and the opportunity as preachers to say, this is as much a part of life as um, what our community, like how we think about our place on this planet ecologically, and the part that we play in this ecosystem, which is human and other than human. It's so many things. It
Yeah.
shows that we are rooted in our place. We're rooted in our community. We're rooted in the ecology, because I think I'm borrowing this from you, but when you're talking about breathing, Jake, you said something once about when we're breathing out, we're only able to do that because the trees have first breathed out. And so we're
Yeah.
already connected to our ecology. It's just a choice of whether a choice and an awareness of whether we're able to show how all of our life is actually is ecological. So I think that we get a little taste of how to start taking that approach in our preaching, with with kind of hot button issues, if you will. And yeah, I'm excited to explore it more. I feel like I've just scratched the surface too of this book. And it's got a lot to offer as we try to move forward as beings who are connected to the web of creation in our surroundings. So yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I know that I'm going to be rereading it, and it will be on the syllabus and coming forward on my classes, because it's really, really brilliant text. And let's go ahead and bring Dr. Hooke in
Yes,
and see what she has to say about this
let's do
book.
it.
We are so excited to be joined by the Reverend Dr. Ruthanna Hooke. Dr. Hooke, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Hooke, could you tell us a little bit about how you were drawn into writing this book? How did you realize that these ideas needed to be articulated, and how do you hope preachers will be formed by this work?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. This book actually goes way back to my dissertation and even before that. So my background is that I'm a theologian and an Episcopal priest, but also a voice teacher, and voice teacher of the Linklater method, which is often used in drama schools and acting schools and so forth. And when I encountered it, which was way back more than 30 years ago, I thought this is something that preachers need to encounter, because the method, the book that she wrote, that Kristen Linklater wrote, is called Freeing the Natural Voice. And I really thought preachers need to free their own voices, and they need to understand how their voices are integrated with their whole self, with body, mind, and spirit. It also just struck me as a very spiritual method in itself. I mean, and that's what the book is trying to lay out. So when I encountered it, I thought, aha, I want to teach this to preachers. And then in the work that I did in theology and graduate school and doctoral work, what I was trying to do was put it into a theological framework to sort of unpack the theological significance of the voice work itself, not to defend it really, but just to sort of try to explain it, to explain what I think is happening in people's bodies and spirits when they work in this way with their voices and their bodies. So that's what the book is doing. And then in the dissertation, I didn't really use this sacramental framework, but in Sacramental Presence, I did. I thought, aha, I think this is a really good way of framing it. If you take the four basic actions of the Eucharist, the taking, the blessing, the breaking, and the giving, you can kind of line that up with different parts of the voice method and the experience of freeing the voice. And you can look at it from these different angles and try to get a better sense theologically of what's going on in preaching. So that's
Yeah,
I
I love that whole approach, and having read your doctoral dissertation back when I was doing my dissertation,
Yeah.
I can say that it really bears witness to the years of allowing some of these ideas to kind of mold and meld with your earlier training and experience with the voice and the body. And your work is every semester we have our introduction to preaching students read the fantastic essay that you write about preaching in the personal.
Oh yeah.
And it's really challenged our students in some exciting ways, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard the prayer, Lord Jesus, hide me behind the cross so that they only see you and not me. And I get what they're trying to do there. They're trying to not have the sermon be all about them. But we see a body up there and we hear a voice up there. And so I love the way that you've taken your work on the breath and on our embodied presence in the pulpit, and you've drawn that into this sacramental theology, which is quite brilliant, I think. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what preaching means for you to like break open ourselves before a congregation, because I think this was a really profound insight that you had.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I like that you've referenced that essay. I too have had a long experience of students coming to me and saying, I think it might be in that essay or somewhere else. Somebody said, well, when I'm nervous, I remember somebody told me they're not here to see you. You know, they didn't come to see you. They didn't come to hear you. I was like, well, yes and no. I mean, yes, I get that we are to manifest the gospel and the presence of Christ and all of that, but it comes through us. I mean, that's the sacramental principle. Like, just as God is using the raw material of the bread and the wine and the water and all the other physical material elements to show God's self into the world, God is using our voices, bodies, minds, experience to make God's self known in the world. So that is the sort of, so if you take that on board seriously, then of course, who we are and what we're doing up there matters. I mean, it's not that it's about us, but it is through us or from us, or something is happening with this material being that I am, and not apart from that. And I felt like with students, it was important for them to realize that they need to show up as the full person that they are, and that God works with that. And if they're trying to hide, or they're trying to pretend that they're not there or whatever, that is actually getting in the way of what God is trying to do. So the breaking open piece was, in one of the chapters of the book, there's the taking, the blessing, the breaking is sort of the third part. The idea there being that there's a need. So I remember a mentor saying to me a long time ago, he said, when I'm preaching, I feel like I have 10 to 15 minutes to take down people's defenses against God's action. That's fair. But then I think if you're doing that, you need to be the first one to do it. You need to be the first one to take down your own walls and barriers and be present in your vulnerability, which, as I said in that chapter, vulnerability and strength are paradoxically related. I love the way that St. Paul talks about preaching, because clearly he says, I came to you in fear and trembling. I didn't have all this fancy rhetoric. I wasn't flashy in any way. But through that very weakness and through the suffering that he experienced in his body, I mean, some sort of thorn in the flesh, we don't know what it was, but that is how God's strength was made perfect in his weakness. It doesn't mean that you are getting up there and just falling apart, but it means that you are allowing yourself to be open to, porous, I would say, to the work of God, the Holy Spirit, the community, your own reality inside yourself. That's what this breaking open is. And we come into it often with such a sense that we have to put up these barriers, we have to be really strong, or we have to have all the answers or whatever. And we're in these fortress-like pulpits almost, oftentimes, hide most of the body and make it look like we really are in some sort of fortress that we're speaking out of. And so I think as preachers, we need to deconstruct that. We need to say, no, it's not about that. We're preaching the cross of Christ. We're preaching this Paschal mystery. That means that we really do need to be broken open in it, to find that vulnerability that's also strength.
That's great.
Yeah, it really is. And to go into a little bit, one of the topics that comes up in chapter 2, we go on this journey with you where we explore the theological and performative depth of this moment of silence that happens
Mm-hmm.
at the
Mm-hmm.
opening, right before a preacher starts to speak. And I really leaned into the text, to your work here, because while I was reading, I felt my body remembering the physical sensations that I have felt, the vulnerability, the feeling of needing to be strong in my faith in sermon preparation and delivery, and that moment before speaking. And I think if we're fortunate, if we're really tuned in, and if we're aware of this posture of suspension between heaven and earth, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
then we
Mm-hmm.
have a moment to offer ourselves as preachers. And, we will say this word, this nourishing bite for the community before God. So we say with our silence, take this, just as
Mm-hmm.
with the Eucharist, take this word, just as we would say, take this bite. And that
Yeah.
silence is so charged with anticipation, with fear, with hopes,
Yeah.
and lots of communication even before words are ever spoken. And so that's really what you're bringing to life in that chapter, as I interpreted it. But
Yeah.
the silence and everything that happens in that moment can be so easily missed because no one enjoys the feeling
Mm-hmm.
of awkward silence. And so
No.
we often want to rush through it and just get right in, and break the ice, as it were. So what's at stake if we breeze through that silent moment before preaching? And what do we as preachers, communities, and creatures before God miss out on when we don't take that pause seriously?
Yeah, I mean, and it's something that I actually try to teach my students. Like, we actually go over to the chapel, get up into the pulpit, and everybody's sitting there watching and listening. The person gets up, they take their moment, they feel their feet under them, they feel their spine and their head, their head floating up on top. All the physical markers, the physical things that ground you, and then it's a very complicated moment because you're grounding yourself physically. If you let breath into your body, then, as I was saying in that other chapter, you're allowing the Spirit to breathe in you, and then you're looking out and you're seeing the people. So you're connecting with that first, whatever your first words are going to be. What is that first opening line, and what is the image? What's the feeling behind that? And then you're looking out and you're seeing the people. So who are these people? So you're kind of taking in all these different elements of preaching. Preaching is so complicated because it's this conversation with God, text, congregation, liturgy, world, all these things. So in that moment of silence, it's kind of like you're allowing yourself to be open to that, to as much of those different conversations as you can be. But it's really, like, I think when you say what's missing, what's at stake or what's lost, it really is that opportunity to be present. So one of the things I do in my classes, it's in the book somewhere, is this exercise where people say, I am here in this room with all of you. And we all say it together, and we say it again. We see, like, is that true? Do we really feel like we're present? But I try to encourage my students to think, at least to think that word, that sentence, as they're standing there. Am I really here with you? Can I allow just that moment of presence with you and me? And then that becomes the launching point for the sermon. Without that, I feel like maybe we haven't really gotten there yet. We aren't fully present yet. And so then the words are sort of coming out of that sense of, I'm not sure I'm really in the room with you yet. So can we allow that moment of just, okay, now I'm coming into this moment of being present with you? That's probably the most basic thing. I mean, the other pieces that I wrote in the chapter were, is this moment of self-offering, kind of like the way the bread is offered on the altar. It is this moment of recognizing kind of the impossibility of preaching, that there's something we're saying about God we can't really capture all of this in words. So the silence is kind of what it comes out. The sermon comes out of this silence, it goes back into silence. And so to sort of try to indicate that. So there's a humility in that, but then there's also this, but I am still offering myself to preach what has been given to me. And then there's also that sense of Sabbath, that moment of just resting in God. So there's like all these different elements to it. But I would say that, probably to answer your question, the thing that's lost if people breeze through it is that they may not have fully arrived. So, and I always find when I work with my students on this, that what feels to them when they're up there like an endless silence does not feel that way to the congregation.
Right.
And that's true for any silence or pause in a sermon. It feels to the preacher like this is going on forever and this is terrible. But for the people listening, it really, those silences don't feel long, and they actually feel like this is allowing me to take in what you have given me. So I think that's probably the most fundamental thing about that moment, is just being present, allowing yourself to be present.
Yeah, and I love the way you talked about grounding ourselves in the present moment. I think it's so easy for preachers, at least I'll speak for myself, to be all in my head. And, so I'm using my head as a center of intelligence rather than my body and my heart. So
Right.
I might be articulating something that I know I wanted to say in advance, but this is the paradox of getting more and more homiletical education, is that we know more things, so we're paying attention to our pacing and our volume and our gestures and our facial expressions, and I'm everywhere but right here in this body, because I'm thinking about all the mechanics.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about your book is you kind of invert the typical pattern of homiletics. A lot of the delivery kind of stuff tends to be at the very end.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, once you figured out all these other things, now we'll talk about delivery.
Right.
But you flip that and you follow this wonderful liturgical theology paradigm of differentiating between primary and secondary theology.
Right.
Which maybe you can unpack that a little bit for the listeners.
Yeah.
But I really want to focus on how the breath becomes a source of primary theology for preaching. And especially this wonderful notion you have about the breath breathing us.
Yeah.
So if you could say a little bit more about that, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, this is one of the insights about this voice method that struck me as so theological, is that in the Linklater method, that a really big point is made of never saying the words inhale or exhale. So it's always let the breath drop in, let the breath fall out. So it's always about allowing something to happen. And Kristen Linklater was very, very strict about the verbiage, about the language that was used, because she really wanted to retrain people's understanding of the breath, that it wasn't something they were making happen, it was something they were allowing to happen. And that was like her sort of principle about how to free the voice, connected to emotion and all that. But for me, it was really immediately about the Holy Spirit. So it's about when you're able to relax your breathing muscles and just observe the breath, you find that it has its own rhythm. It has its own ability to come and go. That's happening when you're asleep, of course. But when you're awake, if you're relaxed enough, you can just let that happen. And it happens in response to this desire to communicate, this impulse, whatever it is you want to say. But it's not like you're making it happen. And that is just this physical experience that's available to all of us. So when we say, when I say that preaching is, I really do think it's this event of God's self-revelation. So I have a high doctrine of preaching in that sense. But what then people get very scared because they're like, I have to make this word of God thing happen. No, I mean, the breath is the sign. It's the experience of, it's much more about letting go and letting something happen through you than it is about making this divine revelation happen. Of course you can't do that. So the breath is this thing that's happening in your body that reminds you that you are not in control of this thing. You are allowing something to happen through you. There's a reason why the breath is such an important part of almost every religious tradition, if you think about it, like meditation traditions and things like that. It's about, because it's this embodied experience of something happening in you that's beyond your own, that's something breathing you that's beyond your own sort of control or something that you make happen. It's this experience of the divine in your body. There's always something you can come back to.
Yeah. Speaking of other religions, I read a quote not too long ago that made me think of your book. It was Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the breath being the link between the body and the spirit.
Yes, right.
And even though he's writing from his Buddhist context, I think it absolutely speaks to the pneumatological framework that you really stress here in this book in such a powerful way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh, and then just to finish on or to say something about primary theology. So this wonderful insight in liturgical theology that I make use of, which is that theology is not just sort of analytical second order reflection on experience. There's actually theology happening in experience. So in liturgy itself is theology in the sense that it is knowledge of God. It's happening. And then you can step back from it and reflect on it analytically and put it into doctrinal frameworks and stuff like that. But it's actually embedded in experience. So you can use liturgy, not just that you take theology, you write all this theology and then you apply it to liturgy, but rather you look at what's happening in liturgy and you think, okay, what is theologically going on in this event? And then I can reflect on that. So it's using the experience as the jumping off point rather than the sort of point of application or something like that. So preaching is theology is happening in preaching, I guess I would say. And then you can take it and reflect on it.
Yeah,
it's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much too that we could just keep going deeper and deeper into each of these topics. And we're sort of jumping ahead, hopefully not too far, but jumping ahead a bit in this question about chapter 5, where there is more conversation about the process of freeing the voice, but it has to do with the feast of the resurrection and the eschatological connections for the preacher and the community. So I wondered if you could tell us about the eschatological implications, along with like continuing this conversation about freeing the voice and the power that it holds. Since you've already started to introduce us to this, can you help us make that eschatological connection?
Yeah, well, so the eschatological piece is something that has really developed and grown in liturgical theology in the last, I would say, 40 to 50 years. So this idea that that the sacraments, and especially I think of the Eucharist, have this kind of eschatological horizon, that they are feasts that sort of point toward the fulfillment of all things at the end of time. So if you think of Eucharistic prayers, certainly in the Episcopal Church, there's always at the end something about grant that we may feast with all your people around your table in this kingdom of justice. And so there's this kind of setting forth of a vision. And so that the feast is like a kind of foretaste. It's a foretaste of this banquet that we're going to enjoy, not just in heaven, but on earth as the reign of God comes into our midst. And so I take that to apply to homiletics too, or preaching rather, as an analogous to the Eucharist, and say when a person has come into their full freedom, their full integration as a person, broken open, shared, etc., you're getting a kind of proleptic glimpse of the human person fully alive. You know that Irenaeus quote, "The glory of God is the human being fully alive." So you're getting a sort of glimpse of that, and that's the kind of eschatological destiny of all of us. And so you get this kind of moment of seeing, aha, this is a person sort of fully alive, fully in relationship with God, fully in relationship with the hearers, and that sort of glimpse gives you this glimpse that then sends you out into the world to try to do that, the kind of work of justice that's going to allow that to be more broadly felt by everybody. And hopefully, the idea is that you're doing this as a preacher, not just so that everyone says, oh, wow, look at that great, fully realized human being, but you're doing it so that everybody then says, oh, this is something that I, you're doing it to give this to people. So that's why it's the giving, that like the meal is given out. It's given so that everybody then begins to feel that they too can live into this identity. So you're sort of showing forth kind of what it means. I think, like I say in the book, like preaching is really about, to me, at its deepest levels, about how to be human before God, or how to be human in relation to God. You're sort of showing people like a vision of this, which then empowers them to do the same thing in their own lives and in the world. So that's why I feel like preaching has this kind of eschatological bent, because it gives you this little foretaste of where we're all hopefully headed, where God is drawing us, each one of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. And I think the way you begin with the breath and the body
Mm-hmm.
as our primary theology,
Yeah.
I think it actually is the only eschatological possibility that opens up for us, because if we start with secondary theology, where we homileticians write these fancy books and tell everyone, okay, now here's how you're supposed to do preaching.
Yeah.
And for some of our students, they might say, oh yeah, that resonates with me. I feel like I can be myself in that. And some people, it's like, well, I don't quite fit that paradigm.
Right.
When we don't allow them to be fully incarnate in their finitude and their humanness and our race, gendered, sexual orientation, all these things that make us who we are, I don't think we're ever going to get to the eschatological possibility, because it's already been determined by the way we started.
Yeah, that's right. So the eschatological possibility has to be a fuller realization of who we are as created by God, and not a kind of undermining of that or an obviating of that. It's got to be a enhancing and drawing forth, kind of who we really are, and that's why God created us in the way that God created us, with the particular gifts God gave each one of us. There's got to be some sort of continuity there between who we are now and who we will be in the eschaton, and that what we're working toward is the sort of fuller realization of that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So I was surprised when I got to your conclusion, because a lot of conclusions in our guild just pretty much rehash all the things we already told everybody, like,
right,
reminding them about how this all kind of holds together, and at least hopefully holds together.
Right.
But you do something really interesting with the conclusion. In thinking about eschatologically, you show how bringing all this stuff forward can help preachers to address social issues of our day, and you single out race and racism and our environmental crisis.
Right.
So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how these topics, can be expressed in a different way based on following the methods and the ideas that you share with us.
Yeah. Well, I some of those concluding sections of homiletics books contain sample sermons, which is a very valid thing to do. But in this particular book, it just did not seem like that was going to work, because so much of it is about your embodied presence. Right. So it's not really about a text or words on a page. So if I were to show you a sample sermon, it wouldn't demonstrate what I was talking about. So then I thought, no, I do think this needs to get a little bit more concrete. So how did this actually help you deal with a real live issue in the world? So those were the two issues that seemed to me to be the most pressing at the time that I wrote the book. What I wanted to show is, like, if you take on this sacramental framework fully, and you seek to be a fully embodied being in your preaching, that this does give you some guidance about how to approach these big, huge issues that we're dealing with. So on the environmental front, and this is, I was saying to Jake before we started that I taught this course this spring called Preaching in a Time of Eco-Crisis. And I just reread my conclusion because we were going to talk about it, and realized I really hadn't taken my own advice. Like I had taught this course that was very abstract. It was like a lot of reading theology and a lot of reading environmental, sort of tracts about this and that, but it wasn't at all embodied. And it really wasn't. And it was not a great course. And I think that was why. And so what I'm trying to say in this chapter, in this conclusion, is that we need to the sacramental principle of that drives the book is also something that people have been drawing on in environmental theology. And this idea that Christ is incarnate, this sort of idea of deep incarnation. Christ is incarnate not just in human beings, but in all of the cosmos. And all of the cosmos is sacramentally infused, if you will. So by taking a sacramental approach to preaching, we're experiencing a connection to the whole of the cosmic order. And in as much as this cosmos and this earth is suffering, we feel it in our bodies. And I would argue that we feel that whether we are prepared to acknowledge it or not.
Absolutely.
We feel that sense of crisis and imminent catastrophe and climate grief and all of that. We feel it, but we don't allow ourselves to feel it because it feels like that would just completely overwhelm us. And I think there's truth to that. But being embodied preachers means trying to allow ourselves to feel and to know this sacramental connection that we really actually have with the created order. And that what I'm saying is, if we allow ourselves to feel that, we preach from a different place, and we feel this breaking open, and we feel the crucifixion and the resurrection. So not just the crucifixion, but also the power of God to move through all of that toward actual resurrection. But if we don't allow ourselves to breathe that in and feel it in our bodies, we can't preach that at all. So we're preaching from a sort of this distance. And I'm saying we need to break through that and allow ourselves to feel what's actually happening, to feel the fear and the grief and the catastrophe of it, the violence of it. But then also in that, the promise is that we will then move toward a sense of God's power to work in us to do something about it. So that's the kind of environmental piece. And then the race piece is, what I said in the book is, like, before we even open our mouths as preachers, dynamics of race and racism are playing into preaching in such powerful ways that it doesn't, before we even think about what we want to say about it, we have to think about who's speaking, who's not speaking, who has been given the space to speak, who's not been given the space to speak. And that basically what that means for people who are white is that they need to move toward that kind of breaking open vulnerability kenosis that is part of the trajectory of the Paschal mystery. And then maybe the people of color, who marginalized folks who haven't been given historically the same right to speak or the same empowerment to speak, need to move toward the other side of it, toward the power of the resurrection side. And then I use the Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, to talk about courage, honesty, and love as the sort of foundations of what might allow a person of color, I guess, specifically, to, drawing from Thurman, to preach with integrity, to claim the right to speak, to find the power to be honest, to have the capacity to speak in love. I mean, it's true for all of us, but I really love the way that he frames it at the end of that book, that those are the things that are needed. Not that they're easy, they're incredibly hard. But again, being grounded in the body is being grounded in both this sort of necessity of self-emptying of kenosis for those in privilege, and the power of claiming one's voice for those more marginalized. So that's what I'm trying to argue in that final section, to show how all of this might be relevant to actual issues of the day.
I was so excited to see that turn happen in the conclusion, and that
Good.
these were the issues that you put in front of us, and that I think even if it isn't explicitly named in that section of the book, that your framework also shows how we don't have to treat each of these things as an individual kind of topical specialized sermon. Even the idea of race and climate catastrophe in the conclusion together are issues that are so interrelated, and we are people that face them in this web of connections wherever we are. And I could really feel the potential of your framework to say, this is a way for preachers to have all of these things in mind and heart, held together as the preaching person in a community where we are all impacted by these issues, and they are not separate from us. They're not separate from each other. It's kind of that taste of what we really can do with that kind of sacramental presence. So thank you for that. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's great.
I guess, so much of this is about the wisdom of the body, that, like, when we're in our heads only, these issues can feel completely overwhelming and we just can't even go near them. But when we allow ourselves to be more connected to our bodies, present in our bodies, we find the depth of the grief and of the the sorrow and of the anger,
Yeah.
but then we also find some kind of wisdom that
Yeah.
is beyond the wisdom of just the analytical mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Hooke, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a invigorating conversation, and I'm so glad that you've written this book. It will definitely be on my syllabi moving forward,
Good.
because I think it has so much to offer our students and offer our Guild of Homiletics in particular to help us kind of rethink how we begin to talk about this impossible possibility of preaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you for this gift.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. I think your project is really exciting. So thank you so much.